Hello! So in this video we're going to take a closer look at the Latin language, which is the other classical language where English gets so many words and morphs from. So we'll just start out with this sort of brief history. One of the things about Latin is that it has multiple phases that we draw from. With Greek, we said, okay, there's this sort of Attic or classical Greek that we get a lot of roots from, and then Koine has an influence as well. But that's about it. It's just really those two versions of Greek. With Latin, it's more because Latin is used in more contexts over more places, and we draw from different parts of Latin, different phases of Latin in different ways. So I wanted to start by going over those. So we know Latin is an Indo-European language, and then it comes to us down the Italic branch, which has some other some other languages on it, but Latin is the big one in the ancient world. And it emerges as its own language probably around 600 BC, and this phase is known as Old Latin. We don't draw words from Old Latin. And one reason is because Old Latin's not well attested. The Romans don't even invent writing for another few hundred years, like the 3rd century BC is about when it starts. And so we don't have a lot of information on Old Latin. Often we have to reconstruct words, so we can't really draw anything from Old Latin. But Old Latin over time evolves and it splits. And it splits according to what we call register, right? Which refers to sort of the context in which we use language. So we get, on the one hand, classical Latin. This emerges around the 3rd or 2nd century BC. This is the Latin that is used for literature and for like official documents of the government, things like that. It is a high register. It's used in really formal and cultural settings. Whereas vulgar Latin is the everyday spoken language. This is just how people talk normally. I mean, you can even have someone who, when they write in classical Latin when they're writing all their speeches, and then they go home and they're probably talking vulgar Latin in their home life because that's just the way people talk. There's a distinction too. Like when you write a paper, you probably use different language than when you're just talking to friends. So this is the idea of different registers. So classical Latin is very well attested. We have all these documents, all these texts from the ancient world that were written in classical Latin. And so it is a huge source of borrowings, right, of all sorts. We get many, many of our borrowings just from classical Latin. And I'm going to actually put parentheses around classical because sometimes, I mean, actually more often, when you look it up in a dictionary, it just says Latin. And when it just says Latin, they mean classical Latin because this is so very much the major corpus of texts from which we draw words and morphs in the English language. Vulgar Latin, on the other hand, is very poorly attested. We have very few records of it because that's just not how people wrote, right? When they wrote, they tried to use the more formal Latin. It exists in some graffiti and a couple like personal letters, but other than that, it's very poorly attested. And so we actually don't draw a lot of words directly from vulgar, right? Because we don't know that many words. And often vulgar words have to be, in fact, reconstructed, right? They're reconstructed based on guesses, based on what's happening in classical Latin and some of its descendants. So not a lot of words directly from vulgar. Okay. Now, by the 3rd century AD, classical Latin has evolved. And it is now known as late Latin. Right? And it's just a natural change, set of natural changes that happen over time. Nothing really specific that drives these. It's just a new phase, a new form of Latin, known as late Latin. It continues to be the Latin that is used in official contexts. But there are some changes that are going on in the empire itself. So we're going to try to swivel and look now at one of my many maps. I have so many maps in my house at this point. A map here that contains the entire Mediterranean region where the Romans lived. So Rome is a city right around here in central Italy, and the Romans conquer and grow over time, and as they go, they spread their language along with them. And so Latin becomes the language of Italy, but also it becomes spoken in France, Spain and Portugal, Britain, North Africa, including Egypt, this region, the Eastern Mediterranean, which includes like Syria and Jordan, modern Turkey, and then this region of Greece and what the Romans called the Illyrian coast, or maybe the Baltic coast. And so Latin spreads. As they conquer, Latin spreads. People don't have to learn Latin in the Roman Empire. It's not required, but it's a good idea, especially if you want to interact with your new rulers. It becomes the language of culture, so people are writing texts in Latin, so you want to be able to read those texts. You have to be able to read Latin. Merchants use Latin as a kind of common language as they go around to different places. So Latin is a good language to know. And what we find is that the upper classes tend to learn Latin because it's advantageous. And then the lower classes, the farmers in the countryside, they might not. But it's the upper classes that write things, right? And that leave records and documents. So they're better represented anyway. And so what we see is that as time goes by, Vulgar Latin is now spoken all over the place. Okay. Now, unfortunately, in the 3rd century AD, Rome suffers quite a bit. It nearly falls apart. And when it comes back together, it gets split up, right? In 395 AD, we see a split between a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern Roman Empire. And it splits right about here, right? Greece, Turkey, the eastern coast, and Egypt form the Eastern Empire, and then Italy, France, Britain, Spain, Portugal, and North Africa here are the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire reverts to the Greek language, which had been common before Latin came along, and continued to be common, honestly, during the whole time that Rome ruled there. And so Latin just dies out in the East, right, to be replaced by Greek and then other languages. And so late Latin is the official language of the Western Roman Empire. Okay, okay, so we're going to come back to that in just a second. So that's late Latin. It's that official language of the later period of the Western Roman Empire. We don't get a ton from late Latin because it's largely based on classical Latin. You know, that's probably where the root comes from rather than late Latin. Now, around the beginning of the early Middle Ages, which is like around 600 or 700 AD, we begin to see new forms of Latin emerging. This Vulgar Latin, for instance, becomes the Romance languages. It will take a lot of time for this to happen, but by around 600 or 700 BC, we stop talking about Vulgar Latin and we start talking about the earliest forms of French or Spanish or Italian and so forth. And that process begins here in the early Middle Ages. And so the light's terrible. There we go. All right. So we said, okay, Greek spoken here, so the Romance languages aren't going to pop up here. Other places also, they spoke Vulgar Latin at one point, but it goes away. The Islamic invasions will sweep across North Africa, and so Arabic becomes the language here. We will see that Germans invade England, so Germanic becomes the language there. But the Romance languages, and Balto-Slavic speakers come down here into the Baltic region, and so Balto-Slavic languages are spoken here. So the Romance languages represent where Vulgar Latin is spoken and never replaced, including Italy, Italian, France, French, Spain and Portugal, Spanish and Portuguese. Okay. All right. So that's the Romance languages. So when you look up words that derive from something like French, you may see that it is traced back to Vulgar Latin. And it'll say, oh, well, French got this word from the Vulgar Latin word, this and this. And so that is where you will see Vulgar Latin. Usually not a direct borrowing, but sort of the parent of the Romance languages, words can be traced back to it. All right, now late Latin evolves into what's called medieval Latin. So no one speaks Latin anymore, and but Latin continues to be used in some official contexts, especially in the church, right? So Christianity has established itself as a major component of society in Western Europe in the Middle Ages. And we know that masses and other rites are said in Latin. The Bible is written and read in Latin, and that Latin, therefore, is the language of the church. And since the church also generally serves as scholarly and educational centers, right? Schools tend to be associated with churches. Monasteries, where monks live, tend to be where books are collected and studied, and new books are written. Because of this reason, Latin also becomes the language of academics. And so we get words relating to the church and to some scholarly ideas from medieval Latin, but it's not a huge number, right? Okay, so that's medieval Latin. It's used in the Middle Ages, especially by the church to write, to perform masses, and then to also write any kind of biblical or scholarly works that are being produced in churches and educational centers associated with churches. Now, by the modern period, starting around the 16th century or so, Latin continues to be used, although it's a new context, right? And this is the context of science and inquiry, right? So science inquiry that is often divorced from the church. Now, the people that are growing up in this period are still being educated, often at schools associated with churches. They're still learning Latin because it's a key language. It's seen as a key language in education. And so when these people in Europe who grow up and they start studying and writing about science, they pick Latin as the language to write in because they know any other educated person will know Latin. So they can all read the same books if ever all the books are written in Latin, right? They will be able to communicate with and understand each other in that way. And so we get what is known as modern Latin. Modern Latin is this language, is this form of Latin used in the modern period in the scholarly scientific context, right? They write in Latin, and sometimes they need to coin new words because they're discovering things, inventing things. And so they coin them, and that enters the vocabulary of modern Latin. So we get a lot of English words from modern Latin. A lot of technical and scientific words come from this phase of modern Latin. Okay, so that's sort of the basic overview of the different phases of Latin and what we use them for, right? Most things are coming from classical Latin. Words that are derived from the Romance languages are often traced back to Vulgar Latin, and then a lot of scientific terms come from modern Latin. They were just coined by people who were doing science and writing in Latin at that time in Western Europe. The other thing I want to note about Latin is just a couple little features about how we derive a root. So Latin is written in the Latin alphabet, but the Latin alphabet and the English alphabet are essentially the same. There's just like one or two differences. And the reason for this is that the people living in England took their alphabet from the Romans, and so they adapted it to their language of English. So we have the same alphabet. So there's no need to transliterate anything, right? The way it's written in Latin is the way it will be written in English. So that's, something that we don't have to worry about. The only thing that you have to think about then when you derive a morph from a Latin word is the ending, just like in Greek. So we said a lot of these Indo-European languages are inflected. They put endings on nouns, adjectives, and verbs to show grammatical properties. And we don't need those endings, right? We pop them off when we want to create a morph for English. And so it's the same idea that we saw in Greek, right? Nouns and adjectives, they have endings that suggest number, singular, plural, gender, and then case, how it's used in the sentence. And just as in Greek, the Latin nouns often have two stems, right? The base stem, which is their basic form, and the combining stem, which is often used when they need to add an ending on. And we can derive from both of these. We don't always. Sometimes we just use the combining form. Sometimes the base and the combining form are identical, so we only get one morph out of it. But you can see either one or two morphs from a Latin noun. In the case that there's two, the first one's the base and the second one's the combining, and the combining one is more often used if something follows, if you have to add something after it, like another root or sometimes a suffix. So we can see this with the Latin word for body, which is corpus, corpore. Corpus is the base form, corpore is the combining form. So corpus shows up in words like corpus, right? It's not combined with anything. Or phrases, if you've ever heard of like the corpus delicti, that's a legal phrase, and that's two separate words. Whereas corpore shows up in words like corporeal and incorporeal, where we've added something afterwards, this al ending, and so we have to use the combining form. Okay, so these Latin nouns and adjectives can have these two stems, not always, but they can. The verbs, too, have inflectional endings. And we said, okay, verbs have endings that show person, number, tense, voice, and mood. And so we often need multiple stems for verbs in order to make all these forms. And Greek can have up to 6 stems for a verb. Latin actually only has 4. But either way, we only ever use 2 stems, right? We use this present active stem, and we use this perfect passive stem. time. So the present active, if you remember, is a stem which indicates a action happening, going on, doing, whereas the perfect passive indicates an action having been completed, right? It has already been done. And so they are used in different contexts. One of the big distinctions is the perfect passive one is usually used to make nouns, because the nouns are like the result of this action. This action's completed and now this is the result. So we can look at distinctions like, we learned, for instance, duke, ducked already, to lead. The first one is always the present active. The second one is always the perfect passive. Often the only difference with Latin verbs is that there's a T. Not always, but often. And we can see the difference in words like induce, which is a verb, and the noun form is induction, right? Or we have a word like extend, which is the verb, but then the noun is extension, and it uses the second stem. So we see that throughout with Latin verbs. Okay, so that's all we really need to go over for the Latin language. And in our next video, we'll talk about just a couple new Latin roots to work with. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.